Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and to chair such a distinguished panel. I think that we are very lucky to have these distinguished speakers today with us. And I'm sure we will have a very interesting panel because the topic, geopolitics of energy and energy security for Europe, is extremely pressing, having all these developments in the field of energy, especially natural gas in Europe. So we are just a year away from Chinese gas coming to Europe, to first of all Greece from next year on, and then Bulgaria and Italy. The Turkish stream is almost there as well. We have a number of other new projects which is on the level of discussions. We have extremely tight competition in the European market, not only between the traditional and new suppliers, but it's not only gas-to-gas competition, but gas-to-renewable competition, gas-to-coal competition. Energy efficiency is there, which is also affecting demand. So I hope that we will cover some of these issues. And in terms of oil, we have this new so-called petro-yuan currency, and I hope that we will hear about this from Mamdouh Salameh. And many other issues that currently is extremely pressing and impacting the geopolitics of energy in the region. So without any ado, I would like to give the floor to Michael Ratner. Mr. Ratner, the US energy policy, are you going to do a presentation or we will have just discussion? That's fine, you can go to the okay. Right. So, we all know the US political support and actually very active involvement in the energy issues in the region, in Europe, and its support of all the non-Russian gas projects, alternative projects, including the Southern Gas Corridor, LNG projects, and others. So can you tell us about the US energy policy towards Europe and all these new projects in general, and what do you see in the next few years? What new projects is likely to come online?
Sure, happy to. And thank you to HAEE and Costas for inviting me today. I am based in Washington, D.C., and so getting the opportunity to come to Europe and hear about European energy security from Europeans is a great opportunity. To your questions, I would say right now it's an interesting time in the U.S. We have about 40 BCM of LNG export existing currently. Probably in the next 2 years we'll add about 80. We have about 80 BCM under construction, and another 80 BCM that has been approved but is not under construction. And so when I look at things in Europe, for the U.S. it really comes down to Russian gas, as you alluded to. On Monday, Mr. Folias asked, is Russian gas good or bad? And I would say yes. It can be good, it can be bad, as it contributes to the market. And it really, for the U.S., I think it comes down, the key question for U.S. policymakers, or one of the differing things between U.S. government officials and Europeans, is that it comes down to the view of reliability of Russia. And for the U.S., it is not viewed reliably as a reliable supplier. I think in some cases that is the similar view in Europe, but I think overall, as has been pointed out to the U.S., that Russia has been reliable for the most part, a little bit less so, I would say, more recently, but for the most part, I mean, since 2009, the gas has flowed. And when it comes to various projects in Europe, to me, anything that, for U.S. policymakers, anything that diversifies from Russian gas is a good thing.
Thank you. So I will come back to the Russian and the U.S. gas competition, LNG and pipe competition in Europe. But before that, Nicolo, the Italian market is, I think, extremely important for the Southern Gas Corridor because the lion's share of gas, 8 BCM of gas from the Chardonnay field, will be exported to Italy, hopefully from the next year on, if everything is Eldorado is going well and there is no delay and all the problems in Italy are solved. So can you tell us about the competition in the market? Well, first of all, competition between the gas coming from new sources and the gas coming from traditional sources, including the Russian gas. Also, the prices in the Italian market, and we would also like to hear about the possibility or the ability of the Italian market to absorb this additional 8 BCM of gas in mid and long run. Do you think that the demand in Italy will be growing or it will be stagnated in the future? And how do you see the developments will be in this market?
Okay, sorry. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for putting the Italian context, the Italian situation at the center of the debate. Of course, Italy is important in the global European picture, and in particular when we look at the southern part of the continent. Italy is the second largest market in the European continent after Germany, is the second largest importer of Russian gas after Germany again, and in particular it has a huge dependence when it comes to electricity generation from gas. It is the second largest gas intensive electricity sector after the Dutch system, which is Netherlands are gas producers. So gas is central for the Italian energy picture, but more in general for the Italian economic and social prosperity. And for this reason, gas, despite of course some trends like the globalization of the gas market, new suppliers coming upstream, the levelization of prices, gas becomes the key source of energy security concern when it comes to Italy, to Italian government, and to Italian companies. It has to be said that our country is probably the most interconnected and diversified as gas importer when we look at in the global arena. We do have 4 interconnection points with the North Sea, Netherlands and Norway, one with from northeast with Russia, and then from the south with Algeria and Libya, and 3 LNG terminals for a total capacity of 15 BCM. So we have a total import capacity of more than 115 BCM with a current demand which is around 75. It has recovered after the crisis. The crisis started, and the decline in the demand after 2008. But of course, there is an overcapacity when it comes to imports. Despite this great diversification enabled in the past decades, since the end of the 70s. If we today look at the Italian energy market, you see, for instance, that in the gas market, you see that, for instance, 43% of total imports are still provided by Russians, and 32% is cumulative by Algeria and Libya, which are not at present very stable when it comes to the security of supply for different reasons. For Libya, as of today, it's more an industrial question, the capacity of Sonatrach and the partner to meet the future demand in the years to come. For Libya, of course, the situation and the crisis into the country, the civil conflict into the country is still a concern when it comes to supplies for Italy. And then you have, of course, this 43% of Russian gas coming into the system, and the possibility that the Ukrainian transit it's halted after 2019, maybe a bit later than this, but of course a sort of geoeconomic concern by the Italian authorities and industry that the monopoly of Germany on the Russian gas might affect, in terms of competitiveness, the Italian market and the competitiveness in general of the Italian economy. So these are the main concerns from an Italian perspective, and of course we are looking when you were mentioned before, new sources. We are trying to further diversify our already interconnected system with new sources. And here it comes in particular the Southern Gas Corridor with the new 8 BCM coming from Chardonnay, that of course will be instrumental to reduce the huge dependence on Russia potentially, or on the other side to balance the instability from certain markets like Algeria and Libya. But certainly the competitiveness of this gas will be based on price, and we all know that the Russian prices are very low, are the lowest in the Italian market. In 2012, 2013, Gazprom has been able to make further discount to the Italian companies, and for this reason, the share of Russian gas has increased compared to the Algerian, for instance. So what is going to be very important, of course, the gas is already sold. So the Chardonnay gas is already sold. So we do not expect any particular block when it comes to the gas entering into the Italian market, but its competitiveness has to be basically on the price. The second source of the diversification that Italy is, or maybe was, I don't know, it's debatable, is the EastMed. Here there are people that are more authoritative than me, of course, talking about the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. But if we look at what's happening there, and there is this cooperation is expected to boost, but not yet completely achieved, in particular for geopolitical reasons. Coming back to the topic of this panel, of course, the EastMed is considered, from an Italian perspective, another important source of diversification of gas. Here there is the role of Egypt, which has become the epicenter of the new EastMed gas region. But of course, there are geopolitical constraints there, and better cooperation is fundamental in order to evacuate in a competitive way those resources that, of course, could be also injected into the Italian market. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for very comprehensive views. I'll move to Mr. Mamdouh Salameh. Mr. Salameh, I know that you are going to talk today about the petro-yuan currency, which is extremely interesting topic and very pressing one, and we hope to hear from you the details and the effect, if any, or if realized, the effect of this petro-yuan currency to the global oil market or even global financial market. So please, the floor is yours.
What is the... First, I would like to thank Professor Costa for inviting me to this symposium, to this important symposium. My topic, as you can see, is will the petro-yuan be the death knell for the petrodollar? On the 26th of March, 2018, China launched the petro-yuan, or the crude oil contracts in Shanghai. That has been a very momentous decision because it will affect the global economy, China's and the United States economies, the future of US sanctions around the world, and attempts by the United States to sue OPEC for what they describe as cartel-like practices and manipulation of oil prices. However, within the first session, which lasted 2 hours and a half, 15 million barrels of contracts were sold. And the petro-yuan is doing fine so far. It accounts currently for 32% of the global traded oil, and I'll explain later why. But first, to understand what the petro-yuan will impact, how will it impact on the global economy, one has to go back and explain about the petrodollar. You know, the petrodollar came into existence in 1973 after the collapse of the gold standard. The Nixon administration was afraid that the demand for the dollar will decline, so they thought of an alternative way, and with the help of Saudi Arabia, they persuaded Saudi Arabia to agree to price and sell its oil exclusively in petrodollar. 2 years later, 1975, OPEC members followed that. Now, the petrodollar was established, as you know, or came into existence in 1973. But to take you back in history, the Bretton Woods Agreement in the aftermath of the Second World War made the dollar the reserve currency of the world and pegged it to gold at $35 for an ounce of gold. Nowadays, to show how much the dollar has devalued or how much the gold oil price, gold has gone up, it is now $1,350 to an ounce. Now, the question is, the petrodollar provided the United States with 3 major advantages. One, it enhanced the demand for the dollar globally. Second, it also enhanced the demand for the treasury bills. And third, it enabled the United States to buy oil with a currency it can print at will. And furthermore, the United States has been using the petrodollar not only for manipulating the oil prices, but at the same time, it has become the core of the sanctions around countries that the United States don't see eye to eye with. Now, the petrodollar has, since its coming to existence, has become the core of the American financial system, enabling the United States to build up its expenditure and at the same time to accumulate more than $22 trillion in outstanding debts. It's far bigger than the US budget. it also enabled the United States to control the global system and to use it as the core for its sanctions around the world. Now, the petrodollar, the petro-yuan, or China, is aiming first to emulate the United States by getting the same benefits, but at the same time, it has been planning to undermine the petrodollar for many reasons, but because it wants also the petro-yuan to represent the economic power of China. China now is the biggest economy in the world at $27.5 trillion in 2019, compared with 21.5 for the United States, based on the purchasing power parity, which is the measuring stick the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund use to compare and measure economies around the world. Now, one more thing is that I said that the petro-yuan will nullify, if not reduce, the effectiveness of US sanctions and against countries the United States don't see eye to eye with. And we notice the failure of the United States sanctions against Iran, partly, for a major part of it, because of the petro-yuan, because China is capable of neutralizing completely the sanctions against Iran by buying the entire Iranian oil exports amounting to 2.1 million barrels a day. Now, there is another side to it. The United States, or the US Congress, is now trying to agree a legislation called the NOPEC, or no OPEC, in which they will be able to sue OPEC for what they describe as malpractices or cartel-like practices and manipulation of oil prices, when we know, and the world knows, that it is the United States that has been manipulating oil prices through the petrodollars and through announcement by the United States Energy Information Administration by claiming rises in inventories of crude oil and products every time the oil price shows signs of rising. I have noticed this. At first, I thought it is a coincidence, but actually it is not. For more than 5 years has been the case. Every time the oil price shows any signs of going, the following day, within 24 hours, the API or the EIA will come up with figures showing a build-up of their inventories. Anyway, OPEC members should not be duly worried about the NOPEC legislation, because they have the firepower to retaliate in terms of withdrawing any investment in the United States, withdrawing every single penny they have in the United States, cutting their production steeply so that the oil price will go up, and that will affect the United States economy through enhancing the budget deficit, because the United States is the biggest consumer of oil, and also through moving away from the petrodollar into the petro-yuan. One question I left before I finish, which is, will the petro-yuan succeed? It will succeed, but it needs the two biggest producers in the world, Russia and Saudi Arabia. Russia is already on board. In fact, it could be the brain behind the whole petro-yuan action. And Saudi Arabia will have no alternative except to accept the petro-yuan if it needs to keep and enhance its market share in China, which is the biggest energy country in the world. I mentioned that the petro-yuan has already accounted for 32% of the global traded oil after 1 year and 2 months from its launch. How is that comes by? It is by almost 11 million barrels that China imports daily. It is 8 million barrels that Russia exports daily. Then it is the exports of Venezuela plus Iran. If you add the European Union as well, which is toying of the idea of using the euro as an oil currency, then the predominance and the dominant position of the United States through the petrodollar will start to decline. In conclusion, I leave you with two of my projections. One, within the next 15 years, we will see the yuan emerging as the #1 reserve currency of the world and the #1 oil currency of the world. The second thing is that the strategic partnership between Russia, which is the superpower of energy, and China, which is the biggest economy, is going to shape the 21st century, and its economics as well as its geopolitics. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Salameh. If we have time, I have a few questions later. But now I would like to turn to Mr. Leonidas Drollas. Yeah, sure. And we will hear from you about the security of energy supply in Europe. So please, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Obviously, I would like to thank Kostas for inviting me. It's the first time I've been to your symposium. Of course, it's one of the last sessions, and then there are not many people, but I hope the subject will interest you, I'm sure. As you can see, the problem is how to secure the security of energy supplies. Of course, security of supplies, of any kind of supply, is crucial when, in particular, when the world is uncertain, as we know. And politics, of course, affect the energy markets, as we all know. The previous speaker referred to many aspects of it, the petrocurrencies, Saudi Arabia and Russia being great producers of oil and exporters. But these supplies are frequently interrupted. We've had, certainly in the oil business, which I've been in for over 40 years, we've had many disruptions of supply through revolutions, lately through sanctions, etc. Regarding renewables, and I'll show you a slide which might interest you, for those of you who are not aware of this, renewables are invariably at the mercy of the vagaries of the weather. Especially, the wind, it's not that reliable. The mankind used to rely a lot on wind centuries ago, and mankind progressed hugely by leaving behind the uncertainty of wind power. So energy security is thus, for political reasons and for weather reasons, an elusive objective. The question is how to reduce the uncertainty, how to reduce the risk. And on this, the obvious answer, and one you've heard previously, is to diversify the sources of energy supply. That is the principle on which I think if we based our policies, our strategies, we would not do badly. Just, I mentioned that I'll say something about wind power, The problem with wind is that it's unreliable. Here you have different capacity utilizations of wind power across the world. The average for the world as a whole is 25%. You have the US's capacity utilization well above 30%. You have some European countries there, Germany, Denmark, Greece as well, and the United Kingdom. The European Union average is 25%, and Greece falls exactly on the European average. The UK is above it. India and China, the countries that have very large capacities, China has 164 gigawatts of wind power, and the EU has the world's largest capacity at 168 gigawatts. But as you can see from this slide, the capacity utilization is well below 50%, and that is a problem for the grid, for the users of electricity, etc. So, as I said right at the beginning, to rely on an unreliable source of energy to a very large extent will create problems. You have to have storage systems, they're expensive at the moment, and so on and so forth. So, moving to the primary energy, the principle of diversification applies to the uses of primary energy. Here I have a number of European countries. I have used what some of you might know as the Herfindahl-Hirschman index of concentration. This applies to monopolies and oligopolies, etc. You take the share of, in this case, of primary energy going to oil, gas, etc., and you square it and sum the results. The index goes from 0 to 10,000. So in other words, if one source of energy has 100% of supplies, 100 squared is 10,000. So the index goes from 0 to 10,000. Here, the European average is around 2,400 units of this index. Most of the countries are above the European average shown here. Norway, in particular, has an index of 5,000, and that is mainly because of its reliance on hydropower. Of course, Norway has a lot of hydropower, and it's not unusual for countries that have that, like Brazil as well, to rely on hydropower. But Greece is the second highest here on the list of countries because of its heavy reliance on oil, not particularly for power gen, but because it's heavily dependent on oil for obviously transportation, but also domestic heating, and so on and so forth. The ideal, of course, is to bring it down to around 2,000, this index, so that you have a wide spread of sources of primary energy. This is primary energy. I'd like to go to the next graph very quickly. There are a lot of numbers on here, on this slide. You don't have to read them or try to read them, but the Herfindahl-Hirschman index for European imports of oil is around 1,700. In other words, the importation by Europe of oil is quite well diversified. There is a problem, though, because although it's well diversified, Russia has a very big contribution to make in terms of crude oil. 1,100 units of the total index is Russia alone. If you look at European imports of oil products, then 87% of the contribution to the product concentration index is due to Russia. If you combine the two, it's not that much. But nevertheless, this shows us that regarding oil, although oil comes from many parts of the world, the domination of Russia as far as European imports of oil, both crude and products, is very significant. If we move to natural gas quickly, here you have EU consumption of natural gas, the blue line. You have the green line, which is EU production of natural gas, and the red line, the imports. From 2002 onwards, imports of natural gas have overtaken European production of gas. And as the European production of gas has continued to decline, the imports are following exactly the consumption pattern of natural gas. The imports of gas since 1984 into Europe have trebled. And here the domination of Russia is huge. Regarding pipeline gas, the index, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, is at 2,859, of which a large component is from Russia. If you go to LNG, the index is 2,382. Most of the LNG imports come from Qatar, so the contribution to the index is 68%. So there's two sources. On pipeline, it's Russia, and on natural gas, it's Qatar. Again, a fairly high concentration of two countries, which of course is a problem. Finally, I'd like to conclude with these remarks of mine. A well-balanced primary energy market with similarly important roles for hydrocarbon, nuclear power, hydro, where to the extent possible, and renewables, offers the best route to energy security in an uncertain world. Where imports of energy are unavoidable, risk reduction is helped, obviously, by the diversification of sources of supply. The attractiveness of a cheaper source of oil supply, of supply generally, for example, the imports of pipeline natural gas, needs to be set against potential disruptions. And here I'm referring to the dependence on Russian pipeline gas. Now we have the Nord Stream 2 going ahead. Germany is heavily dependent on Russia. Italy, we heard before, is very heavily dependent on Russia. That there are question marks about whether this should continue into the future. LNG, like oil, is a fungible commodity sourced from many countries, and an LNG import terminal offers access to natural gas from all over the world, thus constituting a risk-reducing way of securing gas supplies, the same way that oil comes from all over the world. If you have a terminal that receives large tankers, you can import oil, buy oil from anywhere you like in the world. If some source of oil supply there's a temporary disruption, you can always find supplies from elsewhere. The same would apply to LNG. LNG is more concentrated. It's not like oil yet, but one day it will become so, similar to oil. So these are my thoughts on this important subject, which European energy strategists should bear clearly in mind. And the European dependence on Russia is a big geopolitical problem. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Drollas, for a very interesting presentation. Now I want to turn to Mr. Harry Tzimitras. Mr. Tzimitras, so we talked a lot about the energy security in Europe, prices, competition, petro-yuan, etc. So I would like you to tell us what, from your point of view, how, to be more precise, in the event if Russian gas supplies through Ukraine will affect the European natural gas market and those countries that are importing gas from Russia through the Western Balkan pipeline. Can you elaborate on that and the main challenges to security of supply that this can be? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and thank you to the organisers and Costa in particular. It's a delight to be representing the Atlantic Council and the Peace Research Institute Oslo, Cyprus Centre, but the disclaimers are there that the views are very personal. I was hoping to talk about the challenges to energy security in the way you project them to Europe in particular, but also bringing into the discussion the issue of the Eastern Mediterranean, because this is not only what we do, but it's the new area that there's a lot of debate about in Europe as to what extent this could provide alternative routes, in particular in the context of challenges to the Ukrainian gas supply. And I would say that we should approach both subjects with a lot of pragmatism, realism, if you like, which I don't necessarily see at all times, with a sense of urgency, heightened urgency, depending on developments that unfold as we speak, with the need to think outside the box, and also with the need not to take anything for granted, including things that we have tended to take for granted until now. The topic of this panel has already been very much updated, but I think it becomes extremely topical in the way that things unfold as we speak in the East Mediterranean, with an active challenge of the Republic of Cyprus's rights by Turkey at the moment in areas west to the island. And I think this highlights exactly the point of the importance of geopolitics, because a lot of the deliberations during these last 2 days, of course, and rightly so, have been focusing on pricing, on the economics, on markets and all. So I'd like to bring this into perspective, if you allow me. The fact remains that Europe is now very, very challenged or rather the other way around. The Eastern Mediterranean gas and potential gas, to be precise, are very much challenged by the situation prevailing in Europe today. And this is characterized, first of all, by the abundance of gas in Europe and by a very challenging pricing terrain. Russia is very, very difficult to compete with, although we'd like to diversify as we can. Russia, bear in mind that in particular in Yamal, has a cost of 10 cents per unit. This is extremely difficult to compete with. It also has 120 BCM in active storage, ready to flood the market with if need be. The United States at the moment is trying to sell gas to Europe with limited success, to be diplomatic about it, and the cost in the US is minus $2.50, because obviously this is a byproduct as things stand. So it's extremely important to highlight the fact that energy security needs to be diversified, but this needs to be done in a very pragmatic way, knowing what the prevailing situation is. We've also talked about energy security perceptions in Europe, and I'm afraid we can't necessarily talk about Europe in a very generalized fashion. I'm not quite sure if the planning, the rhetoric of Brussels is the same with that of Berlin, of Paris, of The Hague. I'm not quite sure if the European Commission sees eye to eye with these countries, and the matter of Nord Stream was just raised. This is a classic case of a divergence between positions of the institutions of Europe and member states that might challenge also the perspectives of other gas supplies coming in to Europe. So internal European issues is one. The second thing is that obviously we have an unprecedented regional and international situation that very much shapes geopolitics and energy in this region. The unprecedented, hitherto at least, to be self-critical about it, from the point of view of Washington, unprecedented absence of the United States in the Eastern Mediterranean region has created a void that now the US is very willing to fill in again. But this has created a void that has allowed Turkey not to be, for the very first time, under the linkage to Washington, and in the same way in the European Union, both of which have the least leverage they've had on Turkey in modern history. And that, I think, should be a wake-up call. It is also combined with the power projection of Turkey in the whole region, and it's a power projection that needs to be understood within an arch starting from the Aegean, going down to the East Mediterranean, to Cyprus, to Syria. It's, I think, a very clear case of a power projection and the wish for Turkey to give a clear message to the West that you cannot plan in the region or for the region without us, and this is also something that needs to be taken into consideration in realistic terms, talking about the Eastern Mediterranean. The third issue, if you like, is that of the domestic developments in places like Cyprus. It's very unfortunate that all this discussion and the challenges that take place at the moment take place exactly outside the pre-existing framework of international negotiations. It does not allow for the situation to be ameliorated within the existence of a framework where the international community, international organizations can actively step in and take actively or passively steps to amend this situation. So I would suggest that it is high time that we also realistically appraise the situation there and take steps towards establishing a terrain that will be conducive to further cooperation. And finally, all this discussion regarding the possibility of the Eastern Mediterranean being a potential alternative to Europe, yes, but I think this has to be done within a larger time frame. Sometimes we have the misconception that the timelines of companies and the timelines of states coincide. They don't necessarily. Companies, as most of you know better than I do, are there with a larger time frame, a longer time frame of a 20 to 30 year, whereas governments, it's all about today, tomorrow, and the next elections. It's unfortunate that gas discoveries don't take place in places like Switzerland. They take place usually in much more challenged region as such, and the risk is very high. So, of course, the political risks need to be evaluated within that. Bear in mind that companies barely pay more than 30% of the cost. It's usually the banks that cover most of it, and they need to have a 90% probability of return. And for that, they absolutely need the assurances of risk companies that they are going to get their money back within a logical time frame and with assurances of certainty and continuation. A final note, if I may, on cooperation. Gas has brought on both unprecedented cooperation and conflict between the littoral states in the East Med, and that makes it both hopeful and problematic to plan for the region to be a viable alternative to European energy security. But cooperation is a little bit like cholesterol. You can have good cooperation and bad cooperation. If cooperation is designed as a matter of principle to be exclusive, then I think the prospects might be limited. If it is designed in order to be a first step towards a further inclusion and allow for energy to be a platform for cooperation between communities, regions, and countries in the East Med, then I think there are good prospects of allowing it to flourish. So when the market conditions, which at the moment are very challenging, are there, then the political framework will be in place for countries to cooperate and provide some security alternative of energy to Europe. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for an excellent overview of about the possibilities of bringing EastMed gas to Europe. We have still a few more minutes, and I would like to open the floor for Q&A. If there's any question from the floor, please raise your hand. Okay, so yes, one in the back, please.
Yes, I'm from the Ministry of Environment and Energy in Greece, and I have a question in this panel because we speak about geopolitics of energy and energy security of Europe, but actually there's a new question rising through your presentations and discussion forum about energy security versus security for Europe in terms of quality of supply and quality from where do you find the sources? Which territory has the sources? the sources that you consume. For me, that question didn't actually got an answer. I was hoping from the governor there to answer that question in the perception of U.S. politics. How do you secure the supply in terms of quality? If the supplier produces weapons or politics, dictator politics and all that, and the security of supply is relying in Europe.
Okay, thank you for your question. If I understood it, you're kind of asking about the supply of gas from the United States. So one thing to keep in mind, the U.S. government does not produce any natural gas. It does not control any natural gas. It regulates it, and it puts in the structural apparatus in order for companies to export it. But it's really up to the companies to export. And as I referenced in my presentation, potentially within the next 2 years, the U.S. will have approximately 120 BCM of export capacity of LNG, potentially rising to 200 BCM by the mid-2020s, if all those projects get built. The 120 is pretty sure, since those are under construction or already operating. And as the projects that are currently operating, that gas has moved all around the world to over 30 countries. And I would say the biggest influence that the U.S. has had on the global gas market is not even necessarily with the quantity of our gas, which is enormous. To me, the estimates in the BP Stat Review or anywhere else grossly underestimate the amount of gas the United States has. But that aside, the U.S. influence has really been on the contract terms, because even domestically, and our gas is just moving by pipeline, we have the most liquid markets, no pun intended, when it comes to natural gas, in being able to move natural gas around the country. And those contracts for export also are not having the destination clauses, the terms are different, the indexation is different, and so that will hopefully help, as was said earlier, hopefully help move natural gas to becoming more tradable and much more of a global commodity like oil is, and that will help provide energy security for everyone.
The supplies of LNG from the United States to Europe will happen, but not in the short term in a big quantity, because unless their prices meet or be equivalent to the Russian piped gas, there will not be much volume of LNG coming. Furthermore, while there was a reference that Russia could use its overwhelming position in the gas market in Europe as a political or geopolitical tool, that's true, they can do that. But they have proven through many years of supplies of being a reliable supplier, as well as a cost-effective prices provided. Furthermore, Russia is enhancing its presence by the virtually completion by the end of the year of two important pipelines, the Nord Stream 2 and also the Turk Stream. With that, their position will be overwhelming. But that does not mean that the door will be closed before US LNG or Qatari LNG or even Russian LNG. So Europe is diversifying and it is right to diversify their sources of energy. But one fact remains very clear: their dependence on imported gas will be with us for many, many years to come.
Mr. Drollas, do you want to add something?
Thank you. Yes, I agree with my colleague here about his current reading of the situation, but the point of my presentation was that the world is very uncertain and you do not know what's coming round the corner. This is a feature of our lives. We have contended with it over centuries, in fact. So my point was general, that diversification of supplies is a general solution to these problems. Intensifying your purchases of gas from one particular country might be okay today, but it doesn't mean that in the future it's the same. We've seen this in the oil business, in which I, as I said earlier, have been for many, many years. Unexpected events have happened. I was present in BP when I was working in BP, and the Iranian Revolution caught us completely by surprise. Now, the Iranian Revolution not only changed the oil industry, it actually changed the politics of the Middle East dramatically, and it still has a big influence. What is going on at this very moment as we speak with President Trump sending an aircraft carrier group, the Abraham Lincoln, to the Middle East, and making some pretty aggressive statements in the process, both he himself and the Secretary of State, and of course John Bolton, who is well known as a hawk from many years back. So this is an example of something that's suddenly coming along. And incidentally, Greece, I don't know if you know this, but there was quite a big importer of Iranian crude oil. And they received waivers from the US government, with the sanctions coming back in again, not to suffer losses of Iranian oil. Now the waivers have ended, and Iranian oil is not coming to Greece as before. So this is just an example of things suddenly happen. So diversification of supplies, and oil is capable of doing this. Oil comes from hundreds of countries around the world. If you have a deep water port, it's even better. Even if you don't have one, you can lighter oil onto smaller vessels. And LNG is heading in that direction, which is a good thing. So if pipelines versus LNG, I'm in favor of LNG myself. Of course, pipelines are cheaper over certain distances. I think it's up to 3,000 kilometers. A pipeline is cheaper, but there are different ways of looking at cheapness, and security of supply is an important consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to stop here and thank our distinguished panelists for an excellent overview of the issues we discussed today. So please join me in thanking all the speakers today. Thank you.